Good afternoon. Noxtin, Namakayatsin, Klasukamatli. We welcome all of you that are joining us today. My name is Jerry Tello. I'm with the National Compadres Network, and we're very pleased and honored that you decided to join us for this conversation on sacred manhood, an intergenerational conversation on trauma and healing for boys and men of color. But let me invite us to start in a good way, in a traditional way, and with that in mind, I want to bring this drum here, the sacred drum, um, you know, to welcome us in that way, that drum that all of us come from. It's symbolic of the heartbeat of our people, the heartbeat of our mothers who held us and gave us her drum. So even though we talk about sacred manhood, we recognize that everything is interconnected. So we asked permission beginning today of the ancestors of all creation and ancestors to have this dialogue. We give thanks because without them we would not be here. And we invite you to, in your own spirit, acknowledge your own ancestors, those that provided the way, provided the journey, gave you that heartbeat, gave you your drum, gave you your voice, that sacrifice that went through many, many things that some of us don't even know about, but experienced in the journey. We give thanks that way for all our relations that are connected to, from Mother Earth to Grandfather Sun to Brother Wind to the sacred feminine water to Nana Luna and two-legged creepy crawlers, winged, all our relations that way, everybody of all ways, of all faiths, of all genders. We acknowledge all of them today and take a breath and a moment to acknowledge the land that we sit on. I'm on the Tangva Gabrielino land, but we acknowledge all those people, original peoples that allow us to be there and invite them in too to this conversation to guide us to bring truth, bring forth what is truth and what is necessary for us to hear right now. Um, Thank you all for joining us. As I said, my name is Jerry Tello, and we acknowledge my father, Jorge Perez Tello, that is Tapilan, Coahuitecan, out of San Antonio, Texas. We have generations that go back there. And the other side is my mom, Maria Susolage Ramos, who comes from Chihuahua. They came together. Some of us were born in Texas, and some of us were born in Los Angeles, but more directly Compton, Watts, South Central LA, where I come from, and acknowledge my partner, Susana um, Armijo, and we have five children and six grandchildren, Marcos, Rene, Emilio, Paloma, Tanaya, and the six grandchildren, Amara, Naya, Grayson, Harrison, Vivian, and Elias. Yeah. So we acknowledge all of those and all those that are related. And I'm really, really blessed today to have with us, have with us two people that I consider family, that I consider relatives, that I consider great teachers, examples. And in their own right, they carry their own wisdom, their own teachings, their own sacredness, and really, really pleased that Jason Seals and David Woodawong agreed to join us today, and it's an honor. As we sit here talking, I remember we were sitting at Sons and Brothers camp together in a circle, prayer circle with that fire going, and with the three of us amongst a whole number of folks from the Brotherhood of Elders, National Compadres Network. We came together to really embrace, first of all, embrace each other, and greet each other and welcome each other, but then to embrace young boys that were coming from different parts of California, and we learned from each other. We laughed with each other. We joked with each other. We cried with each other, and deepened our relationship that way. And I want to begin that way because a lot of people don't even realize and recognize our sacred interconnectedness as people that way, indigenous and people of color that way. So I want to just thank you both very much. Respect both of you very much for who you are and what you do. But I want to pass the palabra to my brother Jason. um, over here, and allow yourself to introduce yourself, share whatever you feel is important about you and the work you do, and we'll begin there. So, Brother Jason, I'll pass it to you.
Give thanks. I appreciate being here on this beautiful day and really being able to contribute to this dialogue that is so important, offering a new narrative around our boys. There's a way in which our boys are spoken about, there's a way in which our boys are shown. And I think there's a missing narrative. And so the sacredness is a really important part of the conversation. For me, I'm Jason Sills. I want to acknowledge my mother and my father, Thomas Sills and Cheryl Sills, two individuals that gave everything to allow me to be the man that I am. I'm very thankful for all of the contributors that have supported me on my journey. And in return, I'm in service to my community. A number of years in education, but I think most importantly, just my commitment to being in service to my elders, to the younger folk in my community. And so, very excited to be here. Um, so, give thanks.
Hmm. Thank you, Brother Jason. And I also know, Jason's a professor. He's he had his own podcast and works for a number of organizations. Everybody wants Jason to work. He just got so much going. But one of the sacred parts of who Jason is, and we invite him to talk about, is he's a dad, and man, he loves that little boy. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that relationship because. When we see a reflection of ourselves in a younger state, what is our responsibility there? So and with that in mind, I want to pass this to David Budawang, who in our journey, David, been in many circles. You've been in many trainings that we've done, and the work that you do is amazing, on a whole number of fronts. But working with young people, and you're still doing that. You're still doing that, not just young people, but community as well. So I want to pass it to you and allow you to introduce yourself in whatever way you see fit, and so we can begin this conversation by just knowing who David is.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. It's good to see familiar faces. My name is David Budavong. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm first generation Lao American and also part of the LGBTQ community. Um, I'm a child of refugees. My parents they're originally from Laos, southern Laos. Um, but came here so that we can have a better opportunity at everything, right? I represent the Central Valley and I rep it hard. I really believe, like, we are the breadbasket of the world and we give all these fruits and all these veggies to the world. But sometimes we don't have like much for ourselves. So, it's always a piece of my heart. Um, you know, um, have a background in reproductive health and justice that led me to the work of working with young men and boys of color and also healing as well. Worked with a lot of incarcerated young people, and that's naturally how I met um, Maestro Theo, who um, is on here with us, and other elders in the community. Um, and then I try to give back. I am on the Laotian American Community of Fresno board, where we really fundraise all year long and have special projects to support uh, Laotian students and give out scholarships. Um, Recently transitioned last year to working with people who are experiencing homelessness in the Central Valley. Um, Sometimes we often walk by those folks and see those folks holding signs. Um, so that's kind of how that's my job now is being one of the first responders to that. Um, so uh, yeah, I'm here to share, here to learn um, with the rest of everyone. So glad to be on this. this panel tonight. I
Mhm.
mean, this afternoon. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, David. Yeah, and as we begin this conversation, it's always, and I think Jason began to allude to this. There's a lot of things said about us, about men and boys of color, and especially there's a narrative, in my traditional culture, um, when young men become a certain age, when even younger sometimes, there's a naming ceremony that goes on to connect them to their people, to connect them to their traditions, to connect them to their ways, so they don't forget, right? But also to acknowledge the beautiful spirit that they bring, right? Those, and unfortunately, in this Western society, even especially in the educational system, they try and strip us of those things, right? And what a lot of people don't recognize is that those are the things that keep us rooted. Those are the things that keep us grounded. Those are the things that keep us focused, especially in light of the racism and oppression and everything that goes on in the world. So I want to begin there, because usually that's not where the narrative begins. When we talk about us, it's usually about the trauma or the problems or the issues. And I want to, ask Jason uh, to talk a little bit about that history and culture, you know, um, of who we are as a people, who your folks are as a people, and what are those beautiful historical, based assets, blessings, strengths that are embedded in the cultural root of from where you come.
Wow. I appreciate that so much because I've been thinking about this a lot. Specifically as a college professor, I teach a lot of history courses. And I remember a student saying to me one day, I really appreciate all the information that I'm getting, but sometimes I feel depressed or heavy coming out of your class. And it made me really examine what I was offering. It made me be more thoughtful about what stories am I sharing and how some of those stories might be re-traumatizing or might be pulling off the scab. And I began to shift the way in which I shared my curriculum because to the question, I really wanted to explore the goodness, the history, the legacy, the global contributions. And so I began to think about what should be shared. And when I think about the cultural attributes of my people specifically, there's been a great deal of harm in terms of removing identity and removing culture and barriers to create hardship. But certain things that resonate, that remain very present, is like consistent love.
Mm.
One of the things that I appreciate is this nonverbal dynamic that happens between men of African ancestry. We get to connect and express gratitude and love in a way that sometimes is unspoken and it's almost nonchalant, but it's the way that it happens. And I could just think about, like, if I was to go outside right now and run into someone that I know that we're going to embrace, and for some people, that embrace might not mean much, but for two men to embrace, there's something very powerful about that. There's something very spiritual about that. There's something very grounding about touch, right? That is healing, acknowledgement that is healing in a society where our identity and who we are is often minimized and where we might feel invisible. So that love and that communalism is so much present. I think about even the way that we are with our families. I think about the gatherings that we have. And when you talk about having a gathering in my community, my mother cooks every first Sunday. So every first Sunday, we all gather at my mother's home and she provides a meal. And the meal is really an opportunity for us to connect. We might play dominoes, we might play Scrabble, we might be watching sports, but the meal allows us to commune. And one of the things that I appreciate, which is kind of an interesting dynamic, is that you never know who's going to show up because once you become family, you're never not family. So you have
Mm.
people that might be in relationships and they break up. But as my mother say, you might break up with them, but we didn't break up with them. So they're still in the family. So when you have family gatherings and we say family, we're talking about blood, We're talking about folks that you might have been in romantic relationships with, and we have fictive kin. FICTIVE, fictive kin, folks you might have no blood relation to, but they're family.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, learning that, I had to travel back to the continent. And something that was very normal here, I learned is a practice that dates back centuries and centuries, that there was a belief that you couldn't be without family. And that just rocked my spirit in a very like loving way, that like the idea that people couldn't be without family, and if you didn't have family per se, for whatever reason, that you could be gifted family, that you could become integrated into a loving space with people that actually see your humanity and want to pour into you. And so when I think about culture, I think about, like I said, love, communalism, family. And I'll end on this one because I want to also share this space, is spirituality,
Mm.
right? And so when we talk about spirituality, unfortunately, based on how some of us are socialized, we only think of religion, and typically organized religion. When the pandemic hit, I was actually teaching an African psychology course, and a lot of the students were feeling very heavy. We were in home, we were online, we weren't accustomed to, not being face to face. And so you could feel the energy in the class. And I asked the question to the students, what do you do to nurture your spirit?
Mm.
And we had to really unpack what spirit meant. And I talked to them about the energy that runs through your body. What is that energy that you could feel, right? When you touch the soil of the earth? What is that energy that you feel when you hug somebody, right? What is that energy when you get loving words fed to you? And they spent the whole semester exploring what feeds their spirit. And we had
Mm.
students that figured out they had a love for going to the nursery and planting and gardening. You have people that found out they had a love for, making candles or cooking or dance or art. But what was so powerful is that they had a moment to reconnect to something that was always very normal. And one of the students said something, said, I've always done this. I just didn't know what I was doing.
Mm.
And so that's the beauty of culture, is sometimes we don't have the language for it, but it's always with us. And so I
Mm.
think that's these are some of the pieces. These are only some of them. I only touched the surface. This is only some of the things that remain with us that people don't see, that are so distant from the narratives that are projected on channel 2 or channel 4 or in that movie. We have more stories. There's
Mm.
more to our humanity.
Mm. Yeah, but you touch on a whole number of things there, Jason, that even some of us don't realize why we're pulled, to these relationships, why we uh, that traditional food, why that is so sacred to us, and many of us don't realize, in that sacred food that your mother cooked, that's a generational memory. That's a recipe that goes generations back. There's a vibration that when you just smell that, when you smell that cultural food, it's like, oh, dude, man, it's gonna be a good day, right?
Yeah.
And I remember as a kid, growing up in Compton, and night before there was all drive-bys, all kinds of stuff, and so there was a level of stress there. But if I
Mm,
wake up on a Sunday morning and I'd smell tortillas cooking, it was like, oh, my grandma's here. She's making and it was like this aromatherapy, man, that just kind of calmed me, made me happy, to know that I was going to get nurtured.
yeah.
I was going to get nurtured, and that ability, for people to be nurtured, the need for them to be nurtured, and usually we don't think about that when we talk about men, especially when
Right.
it comes to be nurtured, you
Yeah.
know. But that's what we search for, the nurturance, and if we don't get it in a good way, then we're going to look for it in other ways too.
Right.
We'll see that. So I appreciate you sharing the different levels of that, and especially the ones that are connected to our cultural ways. And it also brings to mind that when we see each other, we get loud, like, hey, what's up, man? I mean, it's like our spirit just get
Right.
loud, because and what people don't realize is when you live in a society where you're not welcomed so much, or you're not seen in a good way. When someone finally sees you and say, "Fool, what's up, man? Where you been?" It's like, man, there's a hole there
It's
that
an
gets filled.
embrace. Hmm.
That embrace, that
Yeah.
nurturance, you know. So, I wanna ask David the same thing, and I want to ask you if you can, when we talk about culture, you shared a story when we were prepping for this about your dad and fishing, and it kind of made me laugh because you said you didn't like fishing, but it was a cultural thing, and so it's the same question to you: how is culture and tradition and all of that? How has that served you, and how do you think it serves, you know, men and boys in this sense of sacredness?
I really think it serves and sustains us once you have um, all that instilled in you from your parents or from whoever in your life. It kind of sticks with you. And the story I kind of shared with Jason and Maestro Theo the other night was that my dad would always like take me on these, like, I don't know if you would call it adventures or excursions, but these things on Saturday mornings, right? He'd always tell me I have to wake up early. And one of them was like going fishing, and I'm not like, fishing's cool, right? But I don't want to stay out all day and fish and like mess with the worms. So I can do that. Don't get me wrong. I can do it, but do I want to do it all day? No, I catch my fish and I'm like good to go. So in those moments that's where like I now that I think about it, it's my dad teaching me what he was taught, and also it's about that moment with like your son, right? I'm the only boy, and I'm the youngest, so he took me on those excursions, even though he probably knew I didn't like them as much. We would go to like um, this is how I grew up, right? We would go up to like the slaughterhouse. There was pigs, there was cattle, there were duck, there were chickens, and there were also other young men, young Lao men with their uh, sons as well. Like it was like a thing, right? Um, and those were the kind of the moments that I kind of grew up with. Um, you know, do I still do that now? No, but it was his way of probably bonding with me, and also showing me how he had to do things back in Laos, right? So those things I still remember, and I could still do actually. So if you get stuck in the wilderness or something, I can still fend for things. Um, you know, he never really spoke much about like this is what you're supposed to do as uh, as a Lao man or a Lao boy. He just kind of had me with him, and I tagged along.
And as you're speaking that, I work with a lot of young men that wish they had that moment with their dad,
Yeah.
and wish they could have sat there fishing, that wish they knew how to put that worm on a hook,
Yeah.
I wish they knew how to survive in a wilderness, you know. And I think often we don't recognize the sacredness,
Hmm.
that the sacred moments, the sacred, and sometimes it's fishing, sometimes it's on a basketball court,
Mhm.
Yep.
sometimes it's in my neighborhood we're shooting dice, you know,
Right.
and or at the barbershop, those things, and I know, I grew up in Compton. I knew the barbershop was really important, especially for my African American relatives. That barbershop was like a sacred place where you go and meet
Absolutely.
all kinds of folks and get counsel, and and that still exists in many communities.
Absolutely.
So the the question then becomes is, what is it that we struggle with? Because there's another side to that. We, um, as you're talking, as both of you are talking, recognize that there's a lot of men and young boys that don't have that, don't have a dad to take them fishing. I
Yeah.
don't, I want you to talk a little about your son, Jason, because he's blessed to have a father like you, but But how many men do not have a father like you?
Yeah.
Do not have a father present, or their father is very wounded from generations of racism and oppression and denigration and all kinds of stuff that come to our people. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I think, Maestro, the other thing that I want to mention before I go there really quickly, and it connects with David, is just the power of storytelling.
Mm,
So we started off talking about, how we're connected. And one of the things that I learned from you is the power of sharing our stories. And I was reminded by you and other elders in my life, like a Baba Greg or a Baba Perkins, just the power of sharing these stories. And I think David's story is so powerful because it makes me think about the stories I share with my son. Um, and, I often wonder, is he hearing me?
mm,
And then sometimes I'm reminded when I hear him repeat something to my mother or to his mother, I'm like, oh, he was listening.
mm,
And, it makes me extremely emotional at times because I remember, and I'm not sure if you remember this, but this how far it goes back. We were actually all at a sons and brothers camp during a time period when he was supposed to be born. And I
mm,
remember it was like days away from, him coming into this world. And I was like, well, I don't know if I'm gonna have to leave or what's gonna happen. And I was kind of on edge the whole time because I remember saying to
yes.
myself, I never wanted my son to not remember me being there, because I do so much work in my community, whether it's teaching, being in service, mentoring other young African boys. And I'm always working. And I remember saying I wanted to be present. And part of my story is that my father was incarcerated for the
Mm,
first 10 years of my life. And I remember going through my own journey, wanting to know, did he love me? Uh, why he didn't write me back at times. And I think what was really important for me, I had a teacher, Dr. Milner, one day say to me, Jason, have you been incarcerated? And I responded, no. And he said to me, I just want you to create space in your story for
mm,
your father's humanity as well.
wow.
And he said, I'm not telling you to forget what you've experienced, but create space for him. And that was really a turning point in my life. And my father not being there caused me a lot of pain. But here's the connection. I remember this was like months before my son was born. I said I didn't want my son to be a recipient of my pain. I didn't want to gift him what I was carrying from my father not being present. And it made me really sit down with my father and have some really hard
Mm,
conversations in a way that now we're closer. Now we're able to speak. Now we talk more in a way in which I never thought was really possible.
mm,
And so for my son, I'm not even sure he understands the magnitude of how he's been so much a part of my healing. And when we talk about our sons, I think it's so important that we give our sons not only what we didn't have, but give them an opportunity to be in ways we haven't been.
mm.
And, one day my son, he randomly says, I love you. He randomly in the morning, he says, I want to give you a hug. And, you know, I come from a very loving mother, so it was normal. But sometimes I'm still baffled by like, wow, this little person loves me so much and sees me so much. And what I appreciate about it is that he just sees me. I don't have to be a teacher. I don't have to be doing this or that. He just sees me. And so I'm glad I'm able to give that gift. And I recognize my experience often reflects so many brothers in my community that didn't have a father and didn't have a model. And unfortunately, we had models that were in our community that weren't the best models. But I
Mm,
also want to change that narrative a little bit too, because there were some people selling drugs in my community, and some people that were like, they committed petty crimes in my community. And we look at them as being very deviant and criminal. But I can say that some of those brothers were some of the reasons why I stayed in school.
Mm.
Those brothers also showed me a lot of love and told me this life is not for you. And to me, for them to see my value, and maybe they were looking at themselves and said, wow, I wish I could have done this, or I wish I could have been on this path and pushed me in a different direction. That's the narrative of them too. As I think that we have to uplift the complexities of our people and recognize that you're not just one thing. So that person that's selling drugs, he has a story.
Yeah.
And we need to uplift that story. We just can't condemn people, because a lot of folks think it was just my mom, or it was just like my fortitude that allowed me to be where I am right now. There's a lot of people that are unnamed. There's a lot of people that wasn't walking the straight path, that gave me little nuggets here, or gave me encouragement, or when I was playing basketball, came to the game and was like, you need to continue to play basketball, right? And so those things are so important. And so it's a duality. It's the unfortunate circumstance of fathers being missing, and us seeing things in our community that shouldn't be. There are ills in our community, right? And it reminds me of an exercise that I do, and I'll end here. I do exercise in my class where I play a song called I'm Black by Styles P. He's a hip hop artist. And in that song, he talks about culture and experience of Black people. And I tell my students, divide your paper up into two sections, write culture on one side, write experience on the other. And I say, as he's rapping, I want you to extract what is culture he's talking about and what is experience. And what it helps them to do is to see what are the things that you create and what are the things that have been created to harm you.
Mm.
And it gives them permission not to own that. You don't have to own the drug use, the poverty, the criminality, the materialism. You don't have to internalize that. You don't own that, right? It harms you, but you also can release that. And I feel like it's so empowering. So some of this stuff that's going to be a part of our healing, and I hope people hear this in our conversation, is that there are things we have to acknowledge that's being created to harm us, that we've internalized, that we have to release.
Mm. Mm. So much there, Jason, that you shared. But I want to start with your son's love. Because what a lot of people don't realize is all of us have that love in us, and we want to be loving. It's a central part of who we are, our love.
Yeah.
And we are made to believe that that's an anomaly. That's not, when people say, well, you're a good father, well, what do you mean? We all have that sacred. And I remember, in that way, in the community there in Compton, where all the stuff was happening, walking down the street with my dad, and there was a gentleman that used to sit outside the liquor store right there. Named Mr. Joe. And my dad, when we walked by, he'd say, "Good morning, Mr. Joe." And he'd say, "Hi, Mr. Joe." "Hi, Mr. Joe," right? And he was homeless. He had his bottle of Boone's Farm there, and had a little cup there. All honored him, respected him. And one day we were walking that way, and Mr. Joe had his hair all up in the air. You could tell he had a hard night, and I started laughing. My dad said, "What's the matter with you?" Look at his hair all jacked up. Look at it. My dad slapped me. "Don't you be judging nobody." He's an elder. You say hello. Don't be thinking you know something about anybody's life. Maybe we'll be there someday. And I got punished for that, about judging, because I was seeing and judging him based on the woundedness and not on his sacredness. My father says, reach to his sacredness, right? And so there's a lot of these ways that come through, and not to sidestep the woundedness or the struggle. And I know, David, you have worked, you worked many years in communities working with young men, that struggle a lot, in their life, that out of that struggle, are drugging and out there in the community doing stuff. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that pain that you've seen in young men and older men, and your reflection on that.
You know what? Throughout the years, I've come to kind of a simple, I guess, conclusion, if you will. maybe not final, but to me, what it was like, um, you know, we need to start at the very beginning and the basics of our own traditions and cultures, right?
Mm,
Do things the way that our ancestors did. Our gatherings that we have are those teachable moments, right? Um, for me, I had a big light bulb moment many, many years ago when I was able to go to the motherland, right? Laos, with my immediate family. It's just me, my mom, my dad, my sister. Like at our age at that time, a lot of our friends had children, they had spouses, right? They couldn't really visit the motherland like that. They would have to take everybody. So I thought that was so special. But for me and my sister, we really absorbed a lot about, um, the way that our people did things. Right? We didn't mind staying at the village with all our cousins and relatives, right, and our uncles and aunts. Yes, it was. We it's like a basic house with like plywood and on stilts, right? That's how the village is. But we learned to embrace it, and we enjoyed it because that's how our ancestors lived,
mm,
that's how they gathered, right? um um and also like, for me, it's embracing our masculinity and our feminine side, and others in between. Like there's no right or wrong, um in that kind of way of exploring ourselves. um, those are kind of the things that I've learned. Um, Sharing ourselves with each other. Especially now, I work in a different environment now, where those people they don't have that experience of um, coming together with people who are very, very different from them. Um, so now for me, it's about kind of redoing that and sharing that again with those people, so they know, so that they know, you know how other people live, how what other people's traditions are. I did that a lot actually, working with young people, um, in the past, but now I'm kind of doing it with folks who are my age, or even older now. Um, so it still goes back to the basics. It's about, I tell them it's about them learning where they came from, so that no one can conceal those things from them, and then instilling them in, um, you know, their kids, their family, and their friends.
kind of both you speak, you're talking about, knowing who you are, knowing, your true traditions, but at the same time, recognize that some of us and some of our community have grown up um, being in one. There come to where I grew up, domestic violence and that when I experienced that, it was some shame to me, about, man, why is that happening? I wonder if you can talk about that, Jason. What we do to, who we are in a good way.
I think you asked about the woundedness. Um, you were going in and out, so I couldn't really capture all of what was being said. Um, but what I'll say is, if I heard you correctly, I think the woundedness in my community comes from the ways in which anti-blackness has manifested itself in our communities, and how whiteness has become almost a way in which that people um, have learned to operate. That there are some social norms, some social ideas, um, and the ways in which people have learned to be. And so for me, I think it's really important that we understand the origin of these things, the harm, the ways in which people have been attacked. And I think that's the source of the woundedness. Because when anti Blackness manifests itself, Joe Fagan talks about this in his book, Racist America, that like people internalize these narratives. And so I think folks of African ancestry have also internalized these narratives. And so people are wounded. People are wounded from having their identity being stripped, their culture being stripped away. And so I think that woundedness manifests itself very, very much in the ways in people interact with others, the ways in which people conduct themselves. And I see we see that permeating in our community. David, what are your thoughts around the woundedness that you see or that you've experienced when working with our boys?
I see the I see the woundedness staying with them for a very long time, and then also going from one generation to the next. Um, you know, you're not really taking the time to really deal with that, um, and then the intentional time too. I know we have a lot of more resources as far as trauma informed services and things like that, but
Right.
it's still there. The stigma is still there. um, we need to really uplift those people who not, are doing the work, and also going in to seek that help, because there's not enough of it. I mean, we see it so much going around, right? We've been talking about it forever, trauma informed this, and I know my so Jerry knows this as well. Like for like over 20 years, almost 30 years, like trauma informed. Um, we've been talking about this for a long time. Um, but yeah, if people don't take care of it, it's just going to continue on from generation to generation. And it's really up to us to really uh, encourage those folks to seek that kind of help within the communities, and also sometimes acknowledging those barriers, right? Even though we have all that within our reach, sometimes it's not really within our reach because it might not be culturally responsive or things like that.
Yeah.
So I do see more people and young people kind of putting mental health and trauma on their radar. Um, but sometimes it's also not as accessible
Right.
within their communities. Like I'm just gonna no, I won't say what help
Call it
program.
out. Call it out. Let's be honest. Call it out. Call it
like
out.
like Kaiser can take a long ass time,
Yeah.
Uh, so things like that. Those are barriers, right? And we
Yeah.
have to kind of recognize that. But imagine that for a young person, right? Having to navigate all this. um it's difficult enough for an adult to do that,
Right.
for a young person. So hopefully we can do something more within schools, and get that immediate help to students, really,
Yeah. I
because
think
it's
that,
it's bleeding out into our streets.
yeah. Well, I think what makes it difficult when you said like barriers, I think some people in our community, specifically, I'm thinking of young people, right? So when I think about young boys of color, they're high functioning, and because they're high functioning, we don't see them as being wounded, right? Unless we create safe spaces for their guards to come down, safe spaces where they feel seen, safe spaces where they can receive love, then they function in a way of survival. And someone outside of them might see that as being normal or might see that as being high functioning. So there is a perceived quote unquote high functioning, right? And so we don't see the wound, but you also don't see the wound if you don't see someone's humanity.
Hmm.
Right? Sometimes people are hurting in front of us, but we don't see them. So we don't see the wound. And I think that's the piece that becomes um, to me almost triggering for myself is when I see the wounds that maybe other people haven't seen, in the ways in which, how do we begin to address it? And I feel like in my community, if I could speak just for people of African ancestry, the deep wound has come from not just modern day ills, but some of the deep wounds come from historical ills. People not knowing their culture, people not knowing their identity. So a lot of the work that I do to support healing is actually to help people reconnect to their African self, right? Reconnect to the culture that permeates before enslavement. Reconnect to a part of themselves that they've been sometimes conditioned to reject. And that's when I see a different love begin to permeate for self. And when that love permeates, then it becomes almost a natural, like almost like a natural repellent to the trauma. And it begins to give them a way to engage with those wounds that supports wellness. And so that's the piece that I think gets lost is we have the tools. And I think for me, the healing lies in the culture. It doesn't lie and you go and lie on somebody's couch. And I'm not shunning traditional therapy.
Mm.
Traditional therapy for some works.
Yeah.
But what I've seen work and that's just as powerful is reconnecting to culture.
Yeah, and I think, when we talk about culture, we're talking about a sense of recovering that interconnection and that generational guidance and generational leadership, generational love, but also the accountability that comes from that. Because I've seen in the circles that we've been in, where someone is out of pocket or not, and being able to go to that person in a good way and say, "Hey, young brother, let's talk about this." And I think in our community, that's another responsibility is
Absolutely.
that and I want to lift this up now because we have part of my work has been working the issue of relationship violence, you know
Mm,
and people for instance, for Chicano or Mexicano, people say, well, that's part of your machismo, that's part of you being macho, and that's part of your culture. No, it's not. That's not a part of our culture. That's part of the colonialization that has been integrated, that we believe is part of who we are. Because the true reality for many of us and most of us is that we're matrilineal populations, where the women are the center. And I remember even in Compton when I grew up, back in the 50s and 60s, it was not okay for you to be violent or disrespectful in a relationship. In fact, to the extent that if you did that, the homies in the neighborhood would go after you and
right.
straighten you up, right? Because you weren't supposed to do that. What happens now after generations of removing our culture and those checks and balance systems, right? Now we don't have those cultural ways of accountability. But
Mhm.
I want to lift up that I think part of our healing is recovering the sense of sacredness in our relationships, honoring of women, the honoring of children, the honoring of everyone on wherever you're at in terms of your gender spectrum and your identity spectrum. We have people that come with many identities. And part of that, even in Compton, there was well, I'll just say a white boy there. He grew up in one white family among black and brown. But after a while, he hung with us, right?
Yeah.
And after a while, he began to walk like us, began to talk like us. And the real deal was when somebody, was doing something against us, did he stand with us?
Right.
And he stood with us, and okay, we took care of him too. And that's how big our culture is. Regardless of what's going on in society, if somebody stands with you, then you're going to stand with them.
Right.
And so I wonder if we can talk a little bit about some of the things we need to do. You already mentioned that, Jason, in terms of us teaching the next generation the true sense of values. But how about amongst each other as men?
Mhm.
What are some of the things we need to do? In order to take accountability for our own guidance and rebalancing.
Mm.
Mm. I it makes me
Yeah,
think about like people that I didn't have growing up, right? You had said something about identity, and it sparked a memory in my head of myself at Lao New Year with my I happened to, I was with my own friends. I saw my dad from a distance. He was with his boys. They had like Hawaiian shirts on, so they kind of stood out, right? Uh, they were sitting and having, they were having their beer at the temple. Yeah, we have beer at the temple. And I went over to say hi to him. Seeing my dad out. I haven't seen him out in a while. And this is about 2 years ago, so pre-COVID, when we had gatherings. He was with his boys and and I went up and I said hi, and they asked me that question, right? They're like, so when you getting married and stuff, and having children, I'm like, oh shoot. Um, I'm like, if you only knew, right? I never talked about my sexuality with his friends or anything like that. I was like, well, that's going to be a little bit different, right? If I get married, I'm not going to necessarily marry, a female identified person, right? They're like, oh, I'm like, okay. Um, and then they said something actually kind of shocking next to me. It caught me off guard. They're like, you know what? We just want you to be happy. So
Oh,
anybody you marry, anyone you bring in, that's gonna be our family too. And that kind of took me back. Like I kind of got choked up because they said that in front of my dad. So I know like there still is like that hope and that world of acceptance out there, even though we think like the OGs, like they might have a certain way of thinking. Sometimes you have to put yourself out there because there's younger people that's going to come after you. So that was like a moment for me to hear them say that in front of my dad. So
mm, wow.
powerful moment.
Yeah. So, Jason, what do you think? I mean, what are some steps that we need to take, as men of color to to really address our own woundedness and to bring back that sacredness where we, sometimes struggle.
I would say something very simple is learning to ask for help. You know, I was having this conversation yesterday with my sister, and she said to me, you know, um, my son is going through all these struggles that I see the black men around me having.
Mm,
And as she was having this conversation with me and sharing, I began to think about myself. And I said to her, I struggle with the same thing that, if I'm having difficulties, whether it's emotionally or just stressed, that I have difficult time reaching out to the support network that I have. And I was sharing with her, I have to unlearn some of these ways in which it doesn't reflect really who I am. Um, that I've been conditioned that I have to have it alone by myself. That's a part of being a man, and so I have to unlearn, some of those things. Those are some of the toxic things that I feel like are very much a part of this society that I've internalized, and that some other men have internalized. It's actually not reflective of our community, and so we really need more spaces where we could just be and talk about our experience, whether it's around stress, trauma, relationship issue, financial issues. We need space not to be, warriors in our communities, spaces where we don't have to be a leader in our community, spaces where we can be vulnerable. And I think it's a practice. I think it's a practice to become vulnerable, because one of the things that I think you learn sometimes that's survival, that's really a survival tool, is to almost disconnect from that part of yourself or hide that part of yourself. And so I really feel like there's work to be done in that, where we have to create space where we can be free, be free of expectations, and not be perfect. Like, we can make mistakes. We don't have to say the right things. We don't have to be, quote unquote on point, but just be human.
mm, mm, mm. Yeah, as you were talking, it reminded me of being sitting in circle with all of you and looking around that circle and seeing Baba Arnold Perkins and Brother Greg Hodge and seeing Papa Bear, Isaac, and
Mhm.
and just seeing these elders sitting around who are strong but gentle men, that will love you in a second, but call you out the next second too. You got to get out of pocket, but do it in a loving way, and you don't have to leave the circle, but you have to make sure you're being reflective of who you really are, right? And so, a question came up by somebody in the audience is asked, where are these conversations at? Where can we have these conversations? And this is the very challenge, is that in our systems we don't create enough spaces. We don't create enough support, enough funding, enough credibility, um, uh, of the necessity for these types of dialogues and conversations. We're part of a Healing Generations Institute now. That the Brotherhood of Elders and National Compadres Network are about, and it's really about creating those generational spaces. Because when we did a listening tour and asked young people what do they need, they said exactly what you said, Jason. We need someplace where we can go. People are not trying to make us leaders or teachers or having to be advocates. We just want to be sometimes, and we want to sit in space where there's elders. So we can ask them, "How did you do this, man? How'd you figure this out?" And what they're going to realize is us elders are still going through it too,
Right.
right? And that's okay for them to
It's
see that.
affirming though. It's
Yeah,
affirming. Like the other day when you were talking to us and you said, we need more of this. Like as a younger person, it's affirming to know that the people that you admire and love are also on that journey with you. It makes you feel that you're in community, even in your growth.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you all with the whole space thing. I mean, and also taking in the elements of where we were at naturally, right? Those were some big kind of moments. But what the spaces that have been really, really um, healing for me in my life is um, honestly the retiros in at the mission. Those have been some really concrete, learning moments in my life and really big healing experiences. Just being out there and also sitting in circle and ceremony for 3 days. I've gotten to go a few times the last 17 years. I'm dating myself, but honestly, but honestly, the people that I've met, the stories that I've heard, the circles and ceremonies that have sat around, have really impacted me deeply as um, you know uh, a man, right?
Yeah.
Um, Even though no one really looked like me ever, but it was okay. I never felt that, right? I was always embraced in um, that kind of family over there. So those intentional spaces are definitely, I think, really um, crucial and needed for more folks to heal. And yeah, there's something to be said about the elders and OGs still like going through. Right, we're not all perfect. We still got the journey never ends. The
Yeah.
journey's gonna keep on growing. Um, so yeah, more space, please.
yeah.
Um,
I just want to mention something because you mentioned elder. We joke around in our community and even in our own circle, say there's elders and there's olders. There's some folks are just old, man. And what I mean by that is that just because you're old doesn't mean you're living the teachings. Doesn't mean you're the example. And in order to become and live an elder, you got to do your work. You got to be
Yeah.
humble. You got to continue to do your healing. You got to be ready to hear what is needed, and then you got to be willing to speak up and step up. And so justice becomes part of this too, because there's injustice going on in our communities. And I want to speak to this a little bit before we end. There's a question about how do you deal with injustice, that has happened to boys and men of color and to people of color. What do we do? What are we supposed to do? And see if either you have a reflection on that, because the reality is that racism and oppression and all of that is alive and well, and it's part of the illness that we have to struggle through.
Right. I think for me, first and foremost, I mean, I think it's important that our young people have tools to be able to support their own healing. I think there are things outside of themselves they cannot control. And so when I think of racism, whiteness, police brutality, the toxicity of those things, I
Mm,
want to focus on wellness. I want to give them tools to nurture their well being, practices so they can deal with the stressors that come along with those things. And then I think after that, it's the training spaces where they can like utilize their voice and learn how to organize and become part of organizations. Those things to me follow after. And I think part of it is helping them to explore their purpose in a way where they can use their purpose to then uplift their voice and be in service to their community. That was
mm,
the way in which I was taught, and that's the way in which for me becomes, we become living tools against those things. But we cannot, and we've seen this, right? As a person that reads tons of books and is so much very thoughtful about our history, we've seen our leaders literally put themselves in harm's way, not taking care of their own health. And for me, the health becomes essential first and foremost, and then the advocacy, then the platforms to engage in change. But the change must reside in self first.
wow. That's deep, Jason, because I think that that's a missing element right there. We tend to go to let's get on the front lines and battle and let's prepare people to go to that fight, and then don't realize they have nothing to draw from. And then after the battle, where do the wounds go? And if we don't have a process for regrounding and healing ourselves, then we deteriorate, you
Yeah.
know, over time. Um, David, justice. You're working, with a lot of injustice right now. You see it,
Yeah,
inequity. What do we need to do in order to bring justice to our communities, and but also stay in the sacred manhood of who we are?
I think Jason hit it on the top right there is really starting with ourselves,
Mm,
right, and then finding out what we need to do, and the kind of because sometimes people just jump in to things, and I've seen this especially after the murder of George Floyd, within my own community, the Asian community. I'm like, whoa, like you're jumping in, and which is fine and great, but then I also try to remind them, like, this is not just one rally, one protest, one. This comes from years um, of protests, rally, and things like that, right? And also reminding them they need to stand in. This is the Asian community here. Um, reminding them they need to stand in solidarity, right, with all the other movements that are going around and have come around, and that are still around. So I try to remind. They're younger, so I try to just to gently remind the Gen Z, um, you can't just jump in. There are other things that this came from, um, and then also, what are you doing with that? So now that you have this voice, you're saying something. Um, is there some kind of policy or some kind of whatever connected to what you're doing so that it does serve a purpose, not just if you just get your voice out and that's what you are just doing, then where's that going is my question to them, right? um, um, and now I'm going to flip it the other way, where I'm working with people who are experiencing homelessness. Oh, it's a different level of things right now. It's just not about getting folks off the street, and having compassion. It's other systems that we have to deal with as well. Yeah, you could put someone in shelter, but does that cure um, the problem? No, they're gonna need other services as well. Um, So that's how I'm learning right now to apply to the area I'm in. Um, but there's still more work to be done as far as uh, healing and racial equity. I think it's the big thing is to connect it with policy,
Yeah.
because there's so much I mean rallies and things like that going on, but I don't know how much of that is connected to something that's going to change. Like, is someone going to change this policy, that policy? So that's my big thing when I do rallies now, or I'm like, we got to connect it to something.
Well, I
Mhm.
think it's David. I think it's layered, and Maestro. I think when we talk about injustice, very much like we understand racism, it's like it's interpersonal, it's internalized, it's institutional, and it's structural. So we have
Mhm.
to think about our like our response in the same exact way. Our response needs to address the internalized stuff. We've internalized some of this stuff. We have to also deal with the interpersonal dynamics. Like us having this conversation is extremely powerful because injustice says we shouldn't be here with each other,
Mhm.
that we should be against each other, right? That we should be fighting for the same resources and crumbs that's being thrown out by this foundation and that, philanthropy organization, right? But we also got to be mindful that as we do this work, we do it in a person, we build these partnerships, this family, this connection, and then we can address the institutional things, the policies and the structures that create like this trickle down effect that causes harm. And so even when we're talking about just being, I would have loved for us to continue to do camps, not associated with any foundation, because I think that was some of the barriers, but it was
Yeah.
something extremely powerful about bringing us all together and being at that camp that I feel like was healing for us as elders, as yelders, as even as the young people. It was layers of the healing, and I think when we created that space, then we could have positioned people to be in the right jobs and in the right spaces to start making those policy and practice changes, because practice and policy that causes harm doesn't come through osmosis. It
Right.
comes from people with certain values and certain thoughts, and then they take those things and they make those things into practices that causes harm. And so I feel like there's so much power that we have, but we do need space to harness that power.
Hmm. Uh, you know, thank you for laying it out that way because that brings the dimensions and I'm just going to say to you, we're going to do that camp. We're going to do it. We're going to do it again because it's necessary, for the healing of generations, but also for the establishment of future generations in this element of sacredness. One other question that came through, and I just want to kind of allude to a little bit. Somebody says, "Well, I come from many cultures. How do I do this?" And I always say, bring all the grandmas, bring all the grandmas, right? Bring all your sacreds from all the roots, bring them together. You know,
Yes.
we eat all the food, we'll do all the songs, it's this society that makes us feel that we need to choose.
Right.
So as we end today, I want to get each of you a couple of minutes just to offer, if you were speaking to the younger you, to the reflection of you, what would you tell? And we were directing this to reflections of us in our community. What do we need to do? What do we need to remember in order that we can recover our sacredness, maintain it, and then pass it on to that next generation? I'm gonna go with you, David, first.
All right, I'll keep it short and simple. The younger you is out there already. All right, everyone's really, really tech savvy. How I got through this pandemic that's probably still going on is searching for those things that would really, be part of my arsenal, if you will, of me, right? Of me being a Lao identified queer man. So I got on. I don't get on anymore, but it was Clubhouse. I found a lot of rooms for people who kind of identified the way that I did. But also, there was also people who had like incredible knowledge about Lao people that I can Google, right. and they had this within them. They could read and write and speak the language, and they were artists that I learned a lot from, that I still stay connected from. Um, that's one of the big things, because it made me hone in on that. Um, and then yeah, that was one of my biggest tools, was Clubhouse. It's an app. Um, so
I'll be short as well. I think I started off and I share with you all. I grew up with my father being incarcerated, but I also think part of what people don't understand is that you can have an experience like that and not have a traumatizing childhood. I have a
Mm,
lot of childhood memories that were extremely powerful, extremely joyous. And so if I really had to say anything in terms of my younger self, I would say to my younger self, bask in your joy, protect
mm,
your joy. I think that's the thing that gets lost in all of the toxicity, the abuse, the trauma, the wounds. One of the ways to begin to really create healing is to create spaces for joy and laughter.
mm. Wow. Yeah. And again, recreating a narrative. How often do we hear joy as a prerequisite for sacred manhood? And we see it every day. We see it on the block. People they're just enjoying themselves. They don't worry about nothing else. And
Right,
we think, man, what are you doing? They're probably healthier than us because they're spending some time enjoying. We're over here working ourselves out. But
right.
but but what I want to say, and this is the challenge all the time. I have a 6 month old grandson, and and after he was born, and I got to see him, they put him in my arms. They could put him up to me, and I know the traditional ways, and so I lifted him up and I said, "Thank you, Creator.
Mhm.
Thank you, ancestors, for sending this your representative." And I looked at him and I said, "Mijo, welcome home. I'm your tata. I'm your grandpa. I'm your relative. We are your family." And I made a commitment to my grandson that day, as I have to all my grandchildren. I will walk with you. I will love you. I will give you everything that I can. And I also will tell you truth when it needs to be told. But I'm going to walk with you. And if you fall, I'm going to stop and fall with you and get down on that ground with you. And without shaming you, I will uh, attempt to be the best tata I can be. And when I think about that, I wonder what would this world be
Mhm.
if all young people, and the issue is that some of us as older men never got that.
Right.
So when we get in our circles and we say, "Brother, it's so good to see you. Man, it's good to see you." It's the same feeling.
Yeah.
How is it that we can create in our own lives and our own relationships in this world a priority to be able to acknowledge all people? But since we're talking about men and men of color, how is it that we can look at men of color and see the sacredness? We can embrace them with the love of their ancestors. And
Mhm.
then we can commit to walk with them whatever the journey takes. I believe that's the responsibility that I want to call out
Yeah.
to this community of folks. And I call out to the schools that need to create institutions that really embrace the totality of who we are. I call out to philanthropists that need to fund and support. But I call out to politicians too that need to address the systemic inequity and the racism and the injustice that's going on every day. But it gives me hope, when I sit with you, Brother Jason, and you, Brother David, um, together, because you are that hope. You are those wisdom keepers, and you are the sacredness of our ancestors. And so I just want to thank you so much for being here today and sharing your wisdom. And there's so much more that we could share, but we will do that camp. We are going to gather together, and we are going to do that. I'm saying that right now in front of a whole bunch of folks, but we're going to do it
Yeah.
because it's needed. and we need it. I want to sit that way
Absolutely.
and do that, and so thank you all, for joining us today. You can reach us. You know, each of us, you can look us up, Google us. I'm sure you can find our websites and look at the writings, and you know check out Healing Generations podcast. That's on, and National Compadres Network, Brotherhood of Elders, and we're there for you. Thank you all very much. Sacred blessings to everyone.